This is the Rebel Call channel. Welcome to today's show. I wanted to do a video because I'm sure you've never heard of this person, but Dr. Bennett Braun passed away at the age of 83. And of course, when somebody who exposed and exposes Satanism throughout their lives passes away, the New York Times and the mainstream media make sure that they cash in on that, and not cash in financially, cash in to make sure that people out there know that anybody out there who talks about Satanism or satanic panic, as the CIA labeled it, and they pass away, well, it's a great time to discredit any of the work that any of these people did. Now, I'm a perfect example of somebody who's exposed this for years, who they flushed down the toilet, who they've taken an audience and a platform away from. But people like Bennett Braun are people who are in the same boat throughout history, who have lost their practices, who have lost their license. He was a psychiatrist who was at the cutting edge at the beginning in the 70s, 80s, and 90s of exposing actual satanic ritual abuse. People were coming in to a lot of these psychiatrists around the United States of America, and they were reporting all of these bizarre incidences revolving around the cult. And to the credit of these psychiatrists, they actually listened to their patients. They didn't just dismiss what they were saying. And a lot of these professional medical doctors were taking what was known as multiple personality disorder and realizing there was something more to it, that altars were being created in the minds of many of these people. And there was actually a big conspiracy going on that was being hidden. These psychiatrists were all getting in touch with each other, and all were finding out that there was a common thread here, that people were coming into them and reporting all of these things that nobody would have knowledge of unless they were involved in the occult. Now, what ended up occurring, of course, was the media started picking up on this before the media was fully compromised. It started getting talked about more and more and more, and the CIA had to get their hands on this and then put out misinformation propaganda over and over and over again to discredit anybody who was believing in this. Now, there's a documentary. I'm going to play some clips from it now, then I'll read to you what they put out in the New York Times about Bennett Braun. And in this documentary, there's lots of truth in it. But then you could see how they sprinkle and how they infiltrated. They were actually sending people to these psychiatrists who were programmed and still members of the occult to discredit any of the stuff going on there by coming out and telling them that they were victimized by these psychiatrists, right? So some of the people you're going to see in this clip were identified as being gamma programmed, right? We all know about the delta programming and the beta programming. We talk about the beta programming all the time. If you're not familiar, the beta programming, MK Ultra programming that we see with a lot of these celebrities who are beta programmed, who come out dressed in the leopard print all the time. Well, a lot of these women who were showing up at these psychiatrists were still deep in the occult. And they were going to the psychiatrists to get information about what these psychiatrists actually knew and what they had learned from people who really did go to therapy, because they were trying to come out from this occult brainwashing that they were under. So here's some clips from a documentary, and the documentary itself I'm putting up over on the website, and you could see how they try to discredit how some of these women who were involved in the occult and witchcraft and human sacrifice were actually brought about to the mainstream media to say, hey, any of these psychiatrists who are practicing this, who are telling you that you might have been a member of a cult or you might be a member of a coven, they're all crazy. They're all misdiagnosing all of us who were so sick. Because at the time, a lot of these doctors who were not compromised were coming out and diagnosing people with multiple personality disorder as being victims of satanic ritual abuse. And they had to make sure that that happened. But here's some clips featuring the late Bennett Braun and some other psychiatrists talking about satanic ritual abuse.
It was not a new idea. 10 years before, the bestseller, Michelle Remembers, told the story of a young woman who had traced the source of her unhappiness to repressed memories of being satanically abused by her family. Soon, newspapers and magazines were full of stories of abuse at the hands of satanic cults. Stories involving cannibalism, human sacrifice, blood rituals. The abuse was so terrible, some therapists said, that it caused children to develop multiple personalities as a defense against the pain. Then television joined in.
Magazine 2020.
The Geraldo Rivera Special.
By 1988, when Geraldo Rivera's highly rated special on Satanism was broadcast, satanic ritual abuse was considered who firmly believed that many of their patients were survivors of satanic cults.
Here in Chicago, a group of well-known therapists from all over the country had the courage to share horror stories.
We're talking about people in some cases who are coming to us as patients who were raised in satanic cults from the time they were born.
I have letters in my file from over 40 states in the United States and several provinces of Canada and one from England with very similar data.
If just a tiny bit of it is true, it's appalling, and there's a need for somebody to do something.
Part of the power of the cult, both with the individual and with the others around it, is its ability to induce fear.
Dr. Bennett Braun became a leading spokesman on the connection between MPD and ritual abuse.
It needs to be done. It needs to be looked at.
It was to Dr. Braun and his colleague Roberta Sachs of Chicago that Mary had turned for diagnosis and treatment. Mary's reasons for admission, according to her hospital records, read, "Patient is a victim of satanic ritualistic abuse. Diagnosis of MPD." Mary's vague fears of having been abused in a cult now received the stamp of professional certainty. She was surprised to discover, she said, that her doctors seemed to know more about her family's history than she did.
Roberta Sachs came in and told me that victims throughout the country had identified me as the fifth-generation cult, that we were high up in the cult, that we were cult royalty.
Who's we?
My family, my parents, my sisters, and I.
Once hospitalized, Mary began regular therapy sessions with Dr. Braun and Roberta or Bobby Sachs.
Most of the sessions were about memory. And many of the sessions were with my husband, Joe. He would come to the sessions, and the two of us would sit down, and they would ask questions about, who we knew from church, who was in the people in the school district, what I knew about their personal life, who we socialized with, trying to get more and more information about the cult.
In fact, Mary's doctors were considered leading experts in their field. In November of 1994, Dr. Braun was honored at the annual conference of the International Society for the Study of Multiple Personality and Dissociation.
We owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to Dr. Braun.
Most of the big names in the field were there. Gloria Steinem was keynote speaker and guest of honor.
And the burden for keeping all of this afloat was Dr. Braun's absolutely far beyond the contribution of anybody else in the field of the society.
I want to assure everybody that Rush intends to continue its commitment to ongoing professional education in the field of dissociation.
Multiple personality disorder. We've all seen it dramatized on television. Or
even though it was controversial, Dr. Braun's work was considered to be on the cutting edge of treatment for MPD.
There's just one facility devoted solely to its treatment. And as Channel 5's Rick Salinger reports, it's here in Chicago. Rick?
Ron and Carol, it's located in that canyon of condominiums along Sheridan Road north of Hollywood. Dr. Bennett Braun founded the Dissociative Disorders Unit 1 year ago as part of Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center. Meet Pat.
I'm 32. I'm married. I have 2 children.
By outward appearances, she is normal. But inside are dozens of different people. Where would Pat be without this unit?
I wouldn't be alive. Chances are my children and husband wouldn't be alive either.
After a year in the hospital, Patty traced the satanic history of her family back to the 17th century.
Satanic cult practices have been passed down through the paternal side of the family. Satanic activity has been genealogically traced to a southern Slavic region of Europe during the Medieval Ages, when her forebears were the supreme monarchs of the blood royal. Satanic worship, torturous human sacrifice, cannibalism.
A turning point in Mary's treatment came when Dr. Sachs asked her to attend a consultation with one of the most important experts in cult programming techniques, Dr. Corey Hammond, professor of medicine at the University of Utah. Dr. Hammond lectured often on the origins and practices of the cult.
Use a very, very systematic brainwashing that comes out of experimentation from Nazi doctors and experimentation in the intelligence community with mind control research, and involves medical technology and is very, very sophisticated and is systematic.
In one of his lectures, not available to the public, Hammond described his theories about the origins of satanic cult programming, starting with a Jewish collaborator in the Nazi death camps. His name was Greenbaum, alias Dr. Green.
Some of the people then doing the mind control research were Satanists, the Nazi doctors, and they have used all the technology. And in fact, the kid who came over, whose name was Greenbaum, changed his name and Americanized it to Green, and got an MD in the state of New York and became known as Dr. Green. And he's at the center of this process and is still around. He's around mid-60s and still alive.
According to Dr. Hammond, Dr. Green developed a secret code based on the Greek alphabet, which the cult used to program its members. Examples: Alpha represented general programming. Beta was sexual programming. Delta was the program for killing. Gamma was the one that therapists should look out for. It was a deception program, teaching misinformation and trickery. Dr. Hammond evaluated Mary.
Is there any part of Mary who knows anything about alpha, beta, delta, or theta?
He hypnotized me and put me in trance, and then he asked me about the Greek alphabet and asked me to name any of the Greek letters of the alphabet that I knew, and I named a few. And then he asked me for the gamma erasure code, and I didn't know what he was talking about.
Mary remembers being told that her gamma program was still active. That meant she was still loyal to the cult, and possibly a danger to the staff and other patients.
But I believe that quite a few of them that we're treating are still involved in cults, and that we should not be treating them if they are. And that's a cruel, terrible thing to say, and that is a danger to them and a danger to us.
Mary says that she was told that besides being a cult plant and a spy, she was now strongly suspected of having ritually abused and programmed her son. He had to be evaluated. She had to be deprogrammed.
And again, anybody who has studied this, and a lot of you have, or at least seen videos on this, and you understand how MK Ultra works, you understand how alpha programming works, beta, delta, and gamma programming works, and we know that this came over to the United States of America after Operation Paperclip, when we brought a lot of these scientists, scientists we brought over from, Germany, from, out over in that area over there that we can't say without getting in trouble, brought them over here, and they began doing this and performing human experiments on human beings out in the open. And of course, we know that during that time period, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, satanic ritual abuse became the norm in this country. People were going to psychiatrists at an alarming rate because they had alters and they were programmed to block out and dissociate from all of these things that they weren't sure what was real and what wasn't real because of the abuse that they went through. And this all goes back to trauma-based mind control. I've covered on the website some stuff from Satanic Ritual Abuse Principles of Treatment that Colin A. Ross, an MD, wrote. Obviously, I've covered some of the stuff that Russ Dizdar has covered and exposed. These are a lot of people who have pulled people out of this mind control programming who are trying to escape the occult, but they're put through so much trauma. It is such a difficult practice for people to pull them out, for doctors, for priests, for ministers to pull them out. But through the word of God, through the Holy Spirit, they are able to help a lot of these people who are victimized. So that documentary, the parts that I played for you, I put up over on the website for anyone that wants to watch it. It's not a documentary. It's a frontline mainstream media piece that they put out there where they show you the actual truth, then they discredit it over and over again because these women end up saying, well, we were really just victims. We were victims. We had all this stuff, and somehow we knew all of these things. Then we went to these doctors, and they're telling us that we were abused, and we weren't really abused. And what they were really doing, because this is how the occult works, I've talked about this over the years, they infiltrate everything. They infiltrate your local church. They infiltrate your local school boards. They're everywhere. And they were infiltrating, going to a lot of these any psychiatrist who was starting to get recognition and diagnosing people with this, they were sending people to them, telling them little bits of truth about what they were involved in so that they could go back to their covens and their cults and tell them what these doctors were learning and what they knew, right? They were infiltrating, kind of like we're all infiltrating the hive mind here on YouTube. So Bennett Braun, the psychiatrist who fueled satanic panic, dies at 83. And of course, it's just the New York Times is only covering it because of the stuff that they've promoted with Q to make everybody out there think that these people are all nuts, that they're discredited doctors or doctors who lost their practice. This is how basic mind control works. And these are the people who are at the center of it. The New York Times, the propaganda machine out there that constantly discredits truth. So Bennett Braun, a Chicago psychiatrist whose diagnoses of repressed memories involving horrific abuse by devil worshippers helped to fuel what became known as the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s. He died recently. He was 83. Jane Braun, one of his ex-wives, said the death in a hospital was complications of a fall. Braun had lived in Montana. Dr. Braun gained renown in the early 1980s as an expert in two of the most popular and controversial areas of psychiatric treatment: repressed memories and multiple personality disorder, now known as dissociative identity disorder, which is really you find that the majority of people who have and get diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, DID, are people who are victims of satanic ritual abuse and trauma-based mind control. And they create altars in their mind because of the trauma. You hear about these people, right? Who go through abuse, who put up a wall and never actually face what they do. They create altars in their mind. And every one of these split personalities are trained by these, whatever you want to call them, the priestess and the priests of these satanic covens. And they just abuse these people for the rest of their lives. And then they use them to recruit and groom, etc. So Dr. Braun claimed that he could help patients uncover memories of childhood trauma, the existence of which he and others said were responsible for the splintering of a person's self into many distinct personalities. He created a unit dedicated to dissociative disorders at Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center in Chicago, became a frequently quoted expert in the news media, and helped to found what is now the International Society of the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, a professional organization with over 2,000 members today. And again, the reason that they did this, the reason that they took people like him and then slandered him in the media is the same thing that we've seen recently, right? Think about what just happened with this outbreak that occurred. How many doctors spoke out against what was being told everyone needed to do? Any doctor who spoke out against it lost their practice. They didn't just lose their practice, they lost credibility, and they are no longer allowed to practice medicine again. Same thing here. So they needed, once they were finding out that so many doctors were actually connecting with each other pre-internet, were getting a hold of each other at these conferences and saying, hey, I'm seeing some weird cases here. Some people are coming forward. They're saying that they're members of cults. And, the natural thing people would think when they hear that, it's like, oh, that sounds insane. That's lunacy, right? And these doctors are going, it can't be. I mean, the stories are too eerily similar. There's no way that they would be able to be in cahoots. And then doctor after doctor after doctor was saying, yeah, I see patients with this too. And they realize that there's an actual conspiracy going on here, right? And then all of a sudden, this starts making national news. It starts, they pick up on it, they discuss it dismissingly in the media, and these covens then decide, okay, these are the doctors who are diagnosing their patients with this. They're looking deep into this. They're looking deep into us. They're looking deep into mind control, and we send people to them. Then we have these people come out to ABC News, NBC News, and of course, what we'll do is we'll have them just discredit these doctors and say that they were tricking us and they were manipulating us into thinking this and thinking that, when in reality, these people were sent there to actually spy on the information that these psychiatrists had from the thousands of people who were coming forward. And of course, Russ Dizdar has books about this, right? The Black Awakening. He has books talking about how rampant this is. It is beyond rampant. And now it's just looked at as dissociative identity disorder, DID, in our society. That's what it's deemed. And if you're a doctor, a psychiatrist who looks into satanic ritual abuse, you will lose your practice. Just like any doctor out there that wasn't trying to poison their own patients and telling their patients not to do it lost their practice because they control the fields. They control what you're allowed to diagnose something as and what you're not. And there was an awakening happening. And the McMartin preschool is another thing that occurred then that I've obviously talked about in my awakening process. That occurred then. And they literally just started spinning this as much as they possibly could to the point of exhaustion where people were just going, oh, satanic panic. And to this day, after the event that occurred at that pizza place, they brought satanic panic back, which is why they brought the Q movement back. Because to their surprise, many of us started waking people up to something they thought that they had buried with a shovel 20 years earlier. They didn't expect future generations like me to research, read books, study books that were written by psychiatrists, not just about psychology, but about actual victims who were being identified or being classified as having DID, but really what they were suffering from was traumatic disassociation from satanic ritual abuse. So the article goes on to say the 1980s saw a rise in the number of people, both children and adults, who claimed to have been abused by devil worshippers. It began in 1980 with the book Michelle Remembers by a Canadian woman who said she had recovered memories of ritual abuse and spiked following allegations of abuse at daycare centers in California and North Carolina, and that is the McMartin that they're referencing. Elements of pop culture such as heavy metal music and the role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons were looped in. Again, these are things I discuss. Such stories and fodder for popular TV formats that revealed in the salacious, including talk shows like Geraldo. And again, Geraldo is somebody who's fully compromised. All you have to do is look at Geraldo and know he's compromised. But Geraldo even had this, on his show, and I'm sure they took Geraldo and brought him somewhere and said, don't you ever bring this type of stuff up again, right? But even his show, it didn't really give much credibility to it. They were also trying to kind of spin it in a sense because they were making it seem like the parents from McMartin were trying to make money, that they all just schemed together to make money for a lawsuit, that they'd actually be so low to say that their children had gone through these types of traumatic events. So Dr. Braun, again, the article just goes on to discredit him and talk about how Dr. Braun was, diagnosing people with this, and the satanic panic began to wane in the early 90s. A 1992 investigation found no evidence of coordinated cult activity in the United States. Of course it didn't, because that's when the FBI became fully compromised, and the CIA were already pretty much fully compromised, right? So they needed to put out propaganda to make sure that if you heard any of this type of stuff, here's your excuse. Look, that was what was going on in the 90s before people understood how real propaganda worked. Now we see it on a day in, day out basis because the news is so fake and formulated. We see how they spin every single story. We see how they bring attention to even the most ridiculous things, right? Oh, so-and-so, there's theories out there that so-and-so is a Satanist. Well, they're on stage dressing up as a devil, performing rituals on stage during these, supposed award shows and musical shows. And then they come out and they try to discredit us. They're like, oh, that's not what they're doing. It's just art. Right? We see how pathetic and desperate they are because they can't contain it anymore because it's run so rampant. So, of course, they brought this story up. You know what I mean? Like, as if anybody out there really knew who he was at this point, right? But they wanted to cover it because anytime they could put anything out there to say, oh, here's some crazy, you might hear some of these crazy people on YouTube, even though we silence them, who talk about the satanic panic. Well, here's some more stories for you. Here's a guy who came up with the idea, lost his practice, and harmed people because he was trying to help people. And they will always, until the day we all leave this earth, try to discredit the actual truth. They panic. They live in fear. They wouldn't bring attention to this stuff unless, of course, they needed to bring attention to it to deflect off of the truth of it. So I put up the Frontline episode on the website. That's the full episode of the clips that I took there, where you could see these witches who try to play victim, like, oh, I had all these problems and I went there and they ruined my marriage. They took my kids out of my home because these crazy doctors were just coming up with this stuff. As these women were bringing. They were full on trying to go to these doctors to find out who they knew was connected, who was involved, what generational bloodlines were going to psychiatrists behind the occult's back and reporting these things because they couldn't track and monitor everybody around the clock. But guess what? Now they can with technology and all the listening devices we've allowed them to put in place since the Patriot Act. But this is Bennett Braun, of course, who passed away at the age of 83. And he's not somebody I studied in thorough detail. But anybody out there who has shined light on the actual wickedness going on in this world. I always tip my hat to him for having the intestinal fortitude to stand up to these wicked things. And even in the face of losing your practice, losing your job, being made fun of, being mocked. These are all things, obviously, I've gone through myself, but not to the extent of somebody like Bennett Braun. I've only lost, I'm new YouTuber, but I've only lost channels over and over again, wink, wink. But it shows you how, even after somebody's long gone, that the wicked are paranoid about the truth actually getting out. I thank everybody for being here. I hope you're all doing well. God bless you as always and your families.